Well, good morning everybody. I'm John Muirhead and I'm the Head of Technical Development here at Avinet. And the first seminar that I'm going to be delivering today is about securing your website. So this is looking at your website. How can you make it more secure and make sure that people can't abuse it? To begin with, we've got our website. When we design a website, usually we look at how it looks, how it functions, what kind of content we want to have on there. But also, it's important to think about the security. So this seminar is going to cover some aspects of the security that we can consider when designing the website, and the things that we tend to think about, or maybe other people don't think about, that are really important considerations. So to begin with, what is security? Well, it comes down to CIA. Not the CIA in America, but this is 3 words that define what information security is. First of all, we have confidentiality. So this is about making sure that if we've got private information, it doesn't get released out to other people who shouldn't be able to see it. A classic example of this, patient records. If there's information about your medical history, you don't want somebody to be able to read that who doesn't have authorised access to see that. We also have integrity, and this is about making sure that what we have is accurate. So, is the information stored about you kept accurate, and can you trust those figures? This is really important in financial applications. So anywhere where we're dealing with numbers or we're trying to add up how much has been spent, certain costs and things like that, all of those we want to make sure are applicable to the integrity. And finally we have availability. So this is about making sure that the system is available whenever you go to the website, making sure it's not down and that people can actually use it when they need to use it and you can rely on it. And this is becoming far, far more important in our connected world today, where everything's becoming a mobile app, or we've got websites, lots more content online, and people are relying on the digital world for all of their needs. So these are the 3 things through this talk that I'm going to bear in mind, and we'll talk about some of those aspects a little bit later. So why are we talking about online information? Well, according to a recent survey, 27% of the information stored online isn't confidential at all. So it means it could be accessible to anybody and we don't need to worry about that. But then, all of this other information is highly confidential or confidential. And that means that people need to have certain access to it and certain controls. But it also brings in another aspect. If somebody sees that information, what's going to happen to your business? It's going to have a bad reputational impact. You might lose some data, which I'll touch on in the second talk, and it means poor security for the system. In terms of security breaches, the same survey came to the conclusion that for a small company like yourselves, it might be £15,000 to £30,000 worth of cost to deal with one security incident. And that might be a couple of days' work, but also the reputational loss, the extra equipment, the processes that have to be put in place, all of that. So it's really important to make sure that it's designed right to begin with, to save yourself that extra unexpected cost and also the damage that it does outside of money. So today's talk I've split into 5 different areas about securing a website. The first part is going to be about visibility. Which parts of your website should be visible, which shouldn't? Do you want security to be visible? Then usability. Usability and security go hand in hand, so weaving that in as well and looking at some of those aspects. And have familiarity. As your users use the same system time and time again, they'll become familiar with some aspects of that. So we'll look at how that's been done on other websites and how that can make the website much more secure. We have technical attacks. I don't want to go into too much technical detail today, but I think it's worth looking at some of the basic attacks that malicious people use or try and break into your system with. And if we talk about those, then you'll have some awareness of how those can be prevented. And then we have the relevant standards. There's certain things that may be in your business that you do or you need to do that would help to prevent this risk of some kind of attack on your website and somebody managing to get into it and do something that you don't want them to do. And these standards are very much commonplace across lots of different businesses, and they're really good things to follow. So in terms of visibility, when we look at this car, what do you see? Well, first of all, you might think the car's hidden. So it's hidden by obscurity. And that means that if you can't see it, you can't break into it, you can't steal it, you can't do anything with it. But that doesn't really hide the true picture, because once you've come across that website or that car, you can see that it doesn't have any windows. You could break into there easily. There's so many places that you could get into that car, attack that car, and there's a lot of damage being caused to it in the past. But not only that, if you wanted to drive the car, it's not available because of all the damage to it and the fact it's in the middle of this field. So there's a lot of aspects there that this car is quite a lot like a website. In terms of the confidentiality, well, anybody can see it. The integrity, it's been damaged because you can get in through the windows, and the availability, you can't even drive it. So that car is a good example of a broken website. The classic thing with every website that you go to, and all the advice that's given to consumers, is to look for the padlock. So if you have a look on any website that you go to, there'll be a padlock in the browser bar, or maybe it's at the bottom of the screen, and that will show you that it's secure. But what does that really mean? It doesn't really mean much at all, because all it's saying is that the communication between the server and your computer has been secured by something called an SSL certificate. And what that does is that it provides the security from one end to the other to make sure that the information is transferred securely. But that doesn't mean it's securely stored on the server or on your machine when you're using that website. And a lot of websites have become aware of the padlock issue, and they now say look for the padlock, but they also put pictures of padlocks in the page which make the page look secure, but it might not be. So there's a big need there for user education to make sure that people are aware what makes a secure website. Something else to consider with your website is policies. Lots of websites nowadays have policies on all sorts of things, terms and conditions, about sales, about delivery, about the processes, about privacy, and those kinds of things give users confidence about using your website. So if there's a policy on there which is saying that you can do something, or what's going to happen, how we're going to use your information, how it's going to be secure, then that means that users can look at that and say, yes, that website has considered what they're going to do. Yes, that website has measures in place to try and protect things. The policies, though, might be a little bit long, might be legal, lots of legal terms in there, and not many users read them. But in some ways, having a link at the bottom of the page, or a link where you're signing up for a website to the policy, is all that's needed to give users confidence in using your website. And as long as the content is good and a true reflection of what you're doing with their information, then that's great. What some other websites have started to do to avoid this kind of legalese that you get is to have a very distilled version saying, we won't pass your information on to anybody else, we'll do this, we'll make sure this is secure. And that's a good practice, to have some little summary bits there so that users who maybe are a little bit more security aware and are a bit more turned on in this can have a look and say, yes, I agree with that information. And it builds up that confidence rather than just giving away your details to anybody online. Bruce Schneier, who's a big information security expert, has got a great quote: the more secure you make something, the less secure it becomes. And in this, what he's saying is that the more security that you build in, people will find ways to get around it. As you put in these extra layers of complexity, it might be extra passwords, more complicated passwords, extra user controls, more pages, more hoops to jump through, maybe even devices like you get from banks, like secure keys and different things like that, then people will find ways to get around it that are slightly different. And coming back to the car analogy, this is something that happened maybe about a decade ago. It used to be that you could get in the car, you could hotwire the car, and you didn't need the key. And then car manufacturers started to include immobilizers and chips in the keys. So you now have to have the key in the car to start the engine, and there's no simple way to bypass that. But the thieves have come up with a really clever way now. They'll just break into your house and steal the keys. So it's moved on the threat. The end outcome is still the same. Maybe the attackers have to go to more work. They can't just jump in your car. Now they've got to break into your house as well. But cars are still being stolen, and people will find ways around that. In terms of websites, well, it might be that you put in extra layers of complexity, you put in extra passwords, extra usernames, different ways of working. And as those come into play, people will look for different routes around it. And one of the big cases of the last few years has been phishing. And this is a situation where somebody who wants to log into a system sends out emails, maybe to users or maybe to everybody in the world. And I'm sure you've seen many of these different messages come through that might be saying, "You've got an important message, log in. This is from your bank." Or the ones that seem to be going around recently are something where you log in about a package which hasn't been delivered. And if you go into that website and give away your details, then the attackers will use that. And there have been attacks in the past on things like PayPal, where you go to a website that looks like PayPal, you put in your username and password, it seems to work, but then you've just given away your details to somebody else. So that's bypassing the website entirely, and that's a way around the extra security that's in that process, as it looks like the real website, even though it isn't. So the next aspect I'd like to cover on secure websites is the usability. And Smashing Magazine did a feature a few months back on some great websites that just aren't usable. So first of all, we have this website, which has got lots of visual clutter. There's no way to work out what's going on with that. And in terms of the security, well, it's great obscurity. You might not be able to find what you want, but at least the attackers won't either. And have this website, it loads lots and lots of images, and this affects the availability, because as you're loading all of those images, it takes a long time for the page to display. You can't see what's there. And security in some ways is like this. The more hoops that you put there and you're trying to get people to jump through, then the longer it will take them to go through it, and they might become a little bit tired of it, not use the system, try and find ways around it. So it's good to avoid situations like that as well. And finally, we have this example, which is not very clear what's going on at all or where you click for anything. So that's another obscure website. And if your security is relying on it being obscure, then it's not going to work, because then people won't be able to log in and use the site. Staying on the theme of usability, we have authentication. It's important that when people log in, we can see who's logging in, why they're logging in, where they're logging in, and things like that. And we need to make sure we've got the right users. So the first thing we need is usernames. There's quite a lot of issues around choosing usernames and what people let you use. One common practice is to use email addresses. So you can get people to sign up with their email address, and rather than storing their email address separate and the username, you just have one. And it's easy for people to remember, but the problem is if somebody finds out the email address, they can try and log into that account, they'll try and put in passwords, try and see if they can get access to that person's account. And in terms of a corporate website, it would be really easy to guess those email addresses, as they usually follow a set pattern of maybe first name dot surname, and you can try and work out who people are and try common passwords with those. In terms of passwords, there's also a lot of different considerations. You might want to let people choose their own passwords or assign them for users, or it might be a case of forcing people to have certain patterns of passwords and not include common passwords in that. A lot of big websites now have got strength meters like Google and PayPal and eBay, and as you type in your password as you're setting it up, it tells you this password is secure, this password isn't secure. And by doing that, they're giving you a bit of a guide and saying, with this password, we think this is a good one to use because it will keep your account more secure and make it less likely that someone is going to guess that. The way that people guess passwords is quite interesting, because what used to happen is that people would run through a list of common passwords, and what they would try and do is try each one of those and see if it worked. Now people have got a bit more clever and have done some analysis. Rather than using common words, they use common passwords, look at what other passwords people are using, and some information about the user. So it might be, is it their date of birth? Is it something that they know? If you can find out a lot of information about a user, you can actually get a lot of details and a lot of password information from that. Remember me. It's a common feature on lots of websites to say, do you want to remember me? And every time I come back to the website, it will automatically log me in. Where you do this on a website, it means that the user details are stored in a cookie on your machine. And that means that if somebody else uses a machine, they'll be logged straight in as you. Most websites don't worry about this and don't think about that kind of an issue. And it depends on the information stored whether that is a problem. For online shops and for e-commerce, that can be a problem if somebody else uses your machine, or you've logged in maybe in an internet cafe, or you've logged on a public computer, and you don't want other people accessing your information. And Amazon have come up with a particularly devious way around this, that they automatically log you in, they'll track what you're looking at, but as soon as you go to buy something, if they're not sure it's you, they'll ask you for your password again. And by doing this, they check that you are sat there in front of the computer, you are the person who's logging into that website. So that's another consideration for a secure website. Limiting the number of login attempts. I touched on this with the passwords, but something that is worth considering with secure websites and trying to log in is whether to stop people after having so many attempts at putting in the wrong password. It's like when you go to a cash machine with your cash card, you put it in, you try your PIN number, if you try it 3 times, it blocks the card. And the similar thing with passwords. If you put it in so many times, should it block? It means you have to go and reset it, and there might be a convoluted process for resetting it, either by going through a forgotten your password link, or it could be that you have to ring somebody up and physically get them to reset that. So that would be a way to make it extra secure. There could also be a time delay on this, so rather than locking people out for a long time, it could lock people out for a relatively short time, say an hour or so, and whilst they're locked out, they won't be able to use your site. After that time, they will again. And that limits the number of passwords that can be tried by somebody trying to attack the system. And lots of the automated password attack programs can try 1 a second, or they'll wait a little bit longer, but it would take a few years to get through the common list of passwords if you're getting locked out every hour after 3 passwords. And that would mean that a lot of the attacks could be prevented from your website. Another thing to consider in the website is about validating the data that users put in. Because users, if they can type anything they want in a text box, they can select certain options, it might not be valid, it might not be something that you want in that system. So keeping it secure means making sure that that information is correct, and this comes back to the integrity point. So we have auto-correction. If there's a list of common values and certain things that they should be able to choose from, then make sure that the user only chooses one of those. And it's quite common now on websites to have an auto-populate drop-down list. So as you start typing something in, it suggests, did you mean this? And that means that we can sort out any spelling corrections or any issues like that, and also make sure that the information is at its best. And this also helps with generating reports or looking at any kind of data where you want to check against different systems, or if you've got integration between your front-end website and a back-end system, then that will also keep those congruent and make sure that the information is the same on both. Hints and tips. Not many websites seem to do this, but it's good to give hints and tips as you work through any process to say, why don't you do this? Why don't you try doing that? And these are most commonly around passwords, but it could be on any kind of data in the website. And by entering that kind of information into the website, then the user can follow it and see, well, maybe if I type this differently, I might mean something else. If I type something in a slightly different format, or maybe it's asking for something in a certain format, then we can make sure that that's correct. And that will make sure that the information through the website remains the same. Mistakes and errors. These will always happen through the site, and picking up on these would be great. It ranges from simple things like if you've got 2 dates on a website, say you're booking a holiday, and you say that the leaving date is after the end date. Well, that's obviously wrong, and picking up on that kind of thing will make things more secure. And on the back end, when you're setting these kinds of things up, when maybe you're booking things in, then it's good to have this check, because that's things that might be propagated through the system and might turn out slightly differently and might give unexpected results. So that keeps that part secure as well. And autocomplete. In the same way as autocorrection, autocomplete can fill in some information for the users automatically. So rather than making them type lots of things in, then you can just fill that in for the user. And one of the really big applications of this is for address lookups. So if you've got somebody who's entering in their address, then as they enter that in, you can say, put in your postcode, put in your house number, and it will automatically pull through all of those details. And by following that process and making it automatic, it means that all of that data is valid, we know that that address exists, and that there shouldn't be any problems delivering to that address. I touched on user sessions before when I was speaking about keeping users logged in. And one of the big ways of tracking users is cookies. And you've probably heard a lot about cookies over the past few months, as there's been a new set of rules come in about how cookies are handled. And the ICO published a massive set of guidance on how you should use cookies and similar technologies for tracking on websites. Essentially, what cookies do is place a little file on the user's computer. And what this does is store some information which the server then knows about and can track which user is looking at the website. And there's quite a lot of concern and privacy issues over this, because if you know where a user's looking, you might be able to track what they're doing. And a lot of the adverts that you see on websites try and do this. They track across multiple sites. So as you go around the internet, it will follow you around, and sometimes you get the same advert on lots of different sites as you're going around. And on all of those sites, you'll see the same thing, and they'll keep on hammering that at you until you click on the advert. The other thing it's used for is targeting adverts. So as you're using the website, it will say, you're looking at something like this. So if you're looking at that kind of information, you might like this as well. And that isn't necessarily a security aspect for the website, but it's a big concern for the privacy of the users. And that's something to consider. One of the big things that's happening at the moment is with the cookie law, whether you need to get opt-in or not for having cookies on your website. And there's some difference of opinion on this. Nobody's actually been prosecuted for not getting the opt-in yet. And the ICO advice is generally, if you're a big website and you're doing something very bad with it, we'll come after you. If you're a small website, then maybe you're okay. Maybe it's not too much of a concern. But there isn't really a hard and fast ruling on that, and the rules are still in place on cookies. Timeout. What happens is when a user logs into the website, we can set a timeout for a certain amount of time. And after that time, the user will need to log in again. And this is a way of preventing users from staying logged in for a long, long time, or maybe coming back to the website and it not being the user. There's also another aspect on the server with the timeout, that for each of those users, we have to store a little bit of information on the website, maybe saying what pages are looked at, which users are logged in. And by storing that information, the server will fill up very quickly if we stored all of it. So by only storing recent information about recent users, then we can mitigate some of that risk of the server resources being overloaded or having lots of different connections. And a general rule for timeout is it's normally about 1 or 2 hours for a website. It can be extended, so you can do it for any amount of time. And another exception to this rule is Amazon again. They have a timeout of pretty much forever, but then they will ask you to log back in when you go back. And that's possibly because they've got lots of server resources and they're trying to make it much easier for you to buy things without needing to worry about logging in. Logout link. It's really important to provide a logout link for users so that they know when they've left the system. And sometimes that can be confusing if you're also linked with third-party systems. These could be things like Facebook or Twitter, social media applications, or other applications that your business uses, that when they log out of one system, it's not necessarily logged out of the other. And providing a prominent logout link and then a message saying what they've logged out of and where their information has gone will mean that users will know that their information is secure and that nobody else can come back and use that. It's quite common to place the logout link in the top right of the screen, and by placing it in the top right, it means that users know where to look for it. And familiarity is really good for users. If they know how to use something without it needing to be explained, then that's fantastic and makes using the website a lot easier. And finally, re-authenticate. When do we ask users to re-log in? Is that when they go to buy something, should they have to enter their password again? There's some software out there which you can log into the website and it asks you for the password. If you go into an admin panel and you're trying to edit something on the website, they will ask you to log in again. And those kinds of measures can be put in place to defeat the situation where maybe somebody is looking over someone's shoulder and then goes on the computer after they've done something, and try to prevent some other attacks as well. So in terms of user-generated content, it's really common now on websites to have users to be able to do things on that website, upload their own files, maybe they're editing some information, and they can generate whatever they like, and that can be shared with other users as well. So it's not just about the fact that the information is given to your company, it could be shared with other people and publicly accessible online. The first thing with user-generated content is identities. A lot of websites ask for some kind of real-world identity, so it might be your real name, or an email address to link back to you, or some kind of postal address, some kind of account, or if you signed up, a credit card. And by having that identity, it gives some kind of accountability. So if something does happen, you know who's done the action and can remove that content and can block them very easily. There's some services out there like Twitter that don't ask for any of this, and this makes it very hard to track down who people are. But that does make it more comfortable for people to say what they want, and they can be more confident about expressing themselves. But that's probably not right in a corporate environment where you want to keep a control on all of this information and make sure that only the information you want is shown. Shared information. What information should be shared about different users? If you've got lots of users logging into your website and doing different things, what should they see of each other? If they're placing orders and leaving reviews, should you be able to view what other products they bought? Should you be able to view their name or their email address? Should you be able to view where they're located? All of these things are quite big considerations if you're sharing that kind of information, because some users would like to remain private and some not. And a lot of websites get around this by having privacy controls that a user can turn on and off, so they can have a look and say, yes, I want to share that bit of information, but not that bit. And by including those controls, it gives the user the power to have their own information and see where it goes. But you'll also still have the information on the back end that administrators can see, so it does keep it secure. File uploads. Files are a big problem because there's lots of file types that can be hidden with different executable code, different things that when you bring it down onto your machine will do something malicious. And there's been lots of attacks in the past where people have uploaded files onto websites and other people download them. So if anybody is submitting a file into your website, it might just be to you or it might be to share with other people, then that file must be clean, it must not have any viruses in it, and there's some ways to check this. One is to only allow certain file types. So if you only allow certain file types, only those can be opened. But if you say you only want Word documents, then you'll only get Word documents and you won't get anything that can be executed in that. The other thing that we can do is limit the file size. So rather than uploading massive files which will fill up the server, then it will reduce the size of those. And we'll make sure that people only have a certain amount of data on there. So if you've got big pictures or something like that that are a few meg large, then when you upload those, it won't fill up the server and you'll have lots of space left for everybody else. Something else that when dealing with files that users have uploaded or maybe emailed to you is making sure that you've got an antivirus scanner running on your computer, because when you open those, you don't know what they've sent to you. And they might not have even done it maliciously themselves. It might be that somebody else has planted a virus on their computer and that's attached itself to the file, and when they've opened the file, it does something to your machine and compromises your network. So there's a big importance there on having antivirus on your computer as well. And finally, spam and abuse. If you give the facility for people to communicate, either with you or with other users, then that means that they can put malicious messages in there. They might put things that they shouldn't be saying, they might fill it up. You might get lots of spam, and comment spam through blogs is very common. There's certain technical measures that can be put in place to avoid that. So it might be a case of filtering out those comments, or making sure that those have to be approved before somebody can see them online. Or there's some kind of junk filter on your email that comes through, so that if you've got a contact form, you're not receiving lots of spurious requests and things that you don't really want to have to deal with. So that's about user-generated content and usability. In terms of the familiarity with websites, users become really familiar really quickly with certain websites and the layout of websites. Take, for example, the BBC website. Every page you go on the BBC has a certain format. They've got a certain bar at the top of the screen up here, which has got lots of links in it. And it's also got a search bar. So every time that you go to a page on the BBC, you expect it to look the same. Weather looks exactly the same. Sport looks exactly the same. So those might have different content, but there's always a way to come back and do what you want, to come back and go to where you want. And with your website, that's really important as well, that users know where they can go for certain things and certain bits of information. And when they see your website laid out like that, they'll know that's definitely your website. And when they go to log in, they'll go, yes, I recognise that logo, I recognise that layout. That does give problems if you massively change your site design, that when people go to the website they might be thinking, is this new, is this not? And there have been a couple of cases of banks where they've changed their online websites and then people have gone to log in, it looks different, so they thought, must be a phishing attack, this must be a problem, this isn't a real website. And they reported it to the bank and the bank said, actually, it was us changing things around and making it look different. So maybe for big changes, there's a need for communication with users as well, and tell them something's going to be changing, expect the login screen to look different, and then they'll know all about it. So if we take Amazon again, we're very familiar with websites that work like this, and a lot of websites do copy Amazon because it's a familiar format to so many users. And something that Amazon does very differently to most other websites is the way to log in. Usually you have a username and a password, but what Amazon do is they have your email address and then they have this checkbox saying, I'm a new user, or I'm not a new user and I've got a password. And by having that kind of screen, it means that when people go back to Amazon, they know it's Amazon, they know that it's a slightly different format, but they're used to it. And that's something that for the first time people might find a little bit strange if they've used other online websites, but as they get used to it, they know that that is the way that Amazon works and it keeps their information secure. I thought it'd be worth running over a few technical attacks as well, so that you get a bit of an understanding about what can happen to the website and the way that people can abuse that. There's some really interesting statistics from a recent report on the kinds of attacks against websites, and they all have very complicated and long names, as you can see up there, but essentially the top few are to do with the website and being able to put in requests to the website and it doing something that isn't expected. And those are things that can be developed around and protection put in place on your website to avoid those. So the first one of those is cross-site scripting. And this is where you've got some JavaScript in a page which makes active elements, things move around on the website, and somebody could insert some kind of JavaScript in your page to link to their website, and they can change things on your website. And even worse than that, they could set up some script that would capture the user's information on that page as they log in and post it back to themselves so they get the username and password. There's some really simple ways to protect against this, which is making sure that when you edit pages, you don't let people edit any JavaScript or put any kind of tags in there. And also if you've got user-generated content, this is where the checking comes into place to see, is that content there? Can we prevent against this? Can we remove anything that might be dangerous, like these scripts? Another one is to do with databases. So if you're inputting information into a form on a website somewhere, you might have company name and you put in Avanet, and that goes into the database and forms this kind of a query, which is just a bit of text that the database uses and says, which company are we trying to get? And if we're checking in the case here that it exists, it will return back the information and we can say, yes, that company exists, that's valid. But if somebody put in some information into that box, which is always true, so X is always going to equal X, and that means that that will always come back with a company, then if we're checking that, then that will mean that the company always exists and they'll be able to log in even without knowing a valid name to put into there. And one of the ways to protect against that is by checking for lots of different queries that can happen. And there's lots of frameworks out there now that will automatically check all of this on your website, but there might be older websites or maybe some manual queries that have been built that don't have this kind of protection, and that's usually where testing of websites and auditing fails, is on something like that. A little cartoon here from XKCD a few months ago, which is about somebody who named their child with a name which would cause a lot of problems, purposefully to be a little bit malicious. So the next one is full path disclosure. What can happen is there's an error on the website, and instead of displaying a nice error message saying something's gone wrong to the user, it can display something that looks very horrible, like one of these or one of those. And the user, first of all, is a bit puzzled by this. I've got no idea what's going on with that website or why it's failed. But it's worse than that. It includes some information which is the path to certain files on your server. And with those file paths, somebody who's trying to attack the server could work out maybe what kind of server you're running it on, some more information about the structure, and can use that to attack the website and predict where certain things are going to be. So by making sure there's nice error messages rather than showing some of these developer error messages on there, we'll make sure that the website is far more secure. An attack on availability is a denial of service. And this is where somebody decides that they want to knock your server offline. For some reason, it might be that they don't like your company, or it might be to try and get access to the server themselves. And they set up a botnet or a network of PCs which will attack your computer. As those attacks come in, it will keep on hammering your web server, putting in lots of requests for pages, which probably aren't malicious themselves. So they're just requests for maybe the home page or lots of graphics, things that might take a little bit of time to load. And as those come in, the server gets overwhelmed by the number of requests, and it will mean that the server starts to run slowly, so other users will notice that it's performing very slowly, and also, it's even worse than that, the server might eventually go offline if it runs out of resources. So it's really good to watch for those kinds of things, and that really needs some kind of network protection to make sure that your firewall won't let that kind of attack happen. We also have information disclosure, and this is usually a development problem, where instead of developing a website to keep information secure, there might be a page somewhere or a developer test page or access to an admin page which shouldn't be there. And there was recently a case of this with Apple and AT&T. The AT&T website in America disclosed lots of information about different iPhone users and gave away some information which could be used to compromise those devices. So in a similar vein, if you're dealing with orders and you let people get access to certain orders and view the list of orders and the list of people who have ordered that, or the list of users, then that could give them information which they can use to compromise the system. And there might be things that people don't want to find out. So there's lots of different technical attacks that can happen, and making sure that your website is secure means taking into account all of those. When building a website, there's some different standards to follow, and for information security, the main one is ISO 27001. And this sits along ISO 9001, which is more commonly known, and it provides a minimum basis for information security, a way that you should handle designing the website and dealing with incidents. And by having that in place, it's a framework that's been developed by lots of companies in the past, and it makes sure that you're following best practice and not creating things that are insecure, and make sure you've got the right policies and procedures in place. The other big one is PCI DIS, which you'll deal with if you're dealing with credit card transactions, and there's different levels to that, which I'll come onto in a minute. So ISO 27001. The first thing is it's all about controls, putting in controls that make sure that things happen in the right order. ISO 27001 doesn't say you must do this. It doesn't say you must have passwords that are of this length or that you must take out that. It's all about the process and making sure that you control the process of looking at information security and have considered all of the possibilities within that. It's a total information security management system. So it sits within the management framework of your company and is about keeping the information security complete and keeping all the documentation complete and knowing who's responsible for doing what. It's about analysing the risk and looking at what happens if somebody attacks the system. And sometimes there's a trade-off with that risk, that it might not be worth developing a fix for a problem, or it might not be worth putting in some security because it would cost millions of pounds to do it, yet the risk of the information being lost is so small that it's worth footing that cost. And this is where there might be a difference between maybe commercial systems or a small business, a larger business, and also government and military standards, because at each of those there's different risks that come into play and different outcomes that would happen if that information was lost. And it's about continuous improvement, looking at those processes and going back and saying, are those as good as we can be? Is there anything that we can improve with those? So the ISO is all about a 4-step process. First of all, we have planning out what to do. So this is about making sure we have all of the right things worked out for the website. We know what we're going to do with that website and how it's going to be implemented. The second step is to do. So actually getting on with that and making sure that it's done in the right way. Next we have the check process, and this is a feedback where we look at the website or we look at the system and say, have we done everything we need to do? Is there anything more that we need to do? And we act upon that. So by acting upon that, then it will put fixes in and it will make sure that it works the way that we want to do and that it's been tested properly. And this then goes back around to planning again. It's a continuous process that continually evolves around, and by continually evolving those kinds of standards, we can make sure that we do get to the best place we want to be and deal with ever-changing threats as well. So the second of those standards is PCI-DIS, and with this it's for dealing with payments online. And there's some different things that need to be considered. It's about building and maintaining a secure network, so making sure that where you handle that information and that credit card information, it's secure, not just the website, but the server as well. So protect cardholder data. So again, this is about users and protecting their information from it being used by somebody else. It's about maintaining vulnerability management. So making sure that we look at any vulnerabilities and deal with them as they come up and that somebody has that responsibility. It's about implementing strong access control measures. So for implementing these measures, it makes sure that only people who can see the information can see it, that your passwords are dealt with in the right way, and that users can still use the site but are confident that their information is secure. Monitoring and testing networks, well, regularly that needs to be tested to make sure that everything's the same, that nothing's changed and there's not any new threats in that. And also maintaining an information security policy. I'm sure most of your companies already have some kind of policy on information security, but building your websites and the way that you handle information into that is really useful. So PCI-DIS has 4 different levels, and depending on the size of your organisation and how many transactions go through, then that will determine which level you need to work towards. At the bottom end, we've got level 4, and this means that you don't need to do anything really with your website other than carry out a basic audit and make sure that you've filled in the paper audit and that the transactions are handled appropriately. And these go up to 3, 2 and 1. And as you get higher up in those or lower in the number, then that means that you've got to keep the information more secure and it's more onerous on you to keep that secure. And a good way to mitigate against dealing with all of this is to handle all the payments off your website. If you don't take card transactions through your website, then you only have to be the minimum level, level 4 PCI-DIS compliant, which means that all of the duty is put onto the credit card transaction provider and the merchant to deal with all of that security. So that does keep things a lot more secure and it's a lot easier to control. When dealing with all of these, audits are really important. The first thing about an audit is to keep good documentation. And this means that the documentation is there when people come back to look at the system, or when someone tries to develop it, they can see where it's secure, or if there is an incident that happens, then you can deal with that very quickly as you have the right procedures in place to deal with it. It's about controls, controlling the information, where the information goes, and making sure that all of that is tracked. The network. It's important to audit the network to make sure that there's no vulnerabilities on there that could affect the server from another machine, or any viruses that spread around the network, or anything that could produce any problems with availability, so knocking things offline as well. Penetration test audits are really important as they show where your website might be vulnerable. And by running one of these, you can see places where maybe there could be things patched on the server, there might be software that's out of date, there might be different software development bugs, there might be things that need to be fixed, or new threats that have come along since the last time that can be looked at. So by running these reports, which are often automated, you can see a lot of the common routes in that attackers would use. Usability testing. Testing to make sure that the system is usable as well as secure is really important, as this will make sure that then users don't try and work around the system. So in summary, we talked about visibility. Securing a website is really important to make it visible, or make the security visible so people are confident about it, but then also to make sure that the things that aren't meant to be visible aren't visible as well. So there's some different things and considerations in there. We then have usability. Keeping the system usable is really important to make sure that it is secure and that people don't work around any of those problems. Familiarity. As people use systems and they use websites and they use the internet, they become used to certain things and the way that they work. And by following those established practices, we can make sure that the website is secure, and when people log in, then they know what to expect and they know that they're definitely using your website. Technical attacks. We looked at some of the technical attacks and the things that could happen, and I hope that gave you a good insight into the way that an attacker might think about a website and the things that could go wrong. And finally, the relevant standards. By following those kinds of standards, we know that we're following best practice and can deal with whatever comes up and know exactly how to respond when an incident might recur and how the website is maintained. So with that, does anybody have any questions?
I have just a general question, I think. So you talked about some of the risks, and we saw the graph there of the sort of common risks that are there and the common attacks that happen. What do you think is the future of security for websites? What things do you think have not come along yet that we need to be aware of, or future developments that will be the next step?
That's a really good question, Daniel. Daniel was asking about whether we've considered the future threats and what the future threats to web security are. I think the biggest threat to web security is from mobile devices. And with a lot of the mobile devices that are coming along, we may be developing apps that interface with websites. And by interfacing those with websites, it might leave open another place for an attacker to reach. And a lot of APIs, or application programming interfaces, might be exposed to that, and it might be that people don't make sure that those are secure, and then there might be extra holes in there that aren't in the website. Another big thing on the user-generated content side is social media. As we become more ingrained with social media and it becomes much more integrated with different websites, then it might be that people are posting content on there. We need to moderate it and look for new ways of checking what people are posting up and making sure that that's right and appropriate for the website. Are there any other questions?
We've been sort of investigating bring your own device at the moment, and the obvious pitfalls with that are individuals' security on the devices.
Yep.
So do you think that bring your own device will ever be widespread, and how do you think that people will get around these issues without forcing people into certain controls on their own devices that in effect make them the company's devices?
Right. Well, the question was about bring your own device. Will it become commonplace, and how will we get around that in the future with security? Well, I think bring your own device will become more common as people have got things like iPhones and iPads and Android devices now that they bring along. And also maybe with laptops, it's becoming more commonplace in offices for people to do that. And with the kind of mobile and Wi-Fi connectivity that we've got now, you can always be there, you can always be working. And I think with those kinds of situations, with the security of bring your own device, it's about making sure that the connection is secure and that they're set up in a secure way. So it's about making sure that the software that you're using on the device, whether it be a tablet or a laptop or a mobile phone, is secure to begin with, and also making sure then that there's the right authentication back and the right encryption back to where that information is hosted. So there are a lot of considerations around there, and a lot of apps at the moment just use a simple username and password and cache that. So there might be a need for more authentication when people are using the apps, so they have to log in every time they go to it. Or we could see new devices that are coming out where maybe it takes your fingerprint or some other kind of biometric data, which means that it knows that you're the user who's using it. So it might be that you have to put your thumbprint on, and every time that you go to do something, you just have to authenticate again. The NHS have a system that does that with smart cards, where you can go around to lots of different devices and you put the smart card in and it knows it's you. And that's just another form of two-factor authentication.
As well as authentication, you have a problem. You don't know what's on somebody's hard drive, and you don't know the security of the device itself. How do you think that people may get around these sorts of problems?
So with hard drives or the devices that people bring, there might be things on there that you don't want to introduce to your network. And there's some software out there now which will scan any device that's connected to your network. And when somebody goes onto the Wi-Fi network, it will make sure they've got this software installed. And once it's installed, it will scan their device and make sure that it hasn't got any viruses, it hasn't got any malicious software, and track what they're doing. But another thing that can be put in place is tracking who's using the Wi-Fi. In a lot of places you have a common Wi-Fi password, and what would be good in a corporate environment is to have some kind of login which has the username and password in there as well. So people have to log in to use the Wi-Fi, and you can track that device and see who's used it. So in the case where maybe something is introduced to the network, you can isolate it a lot easier and make sure that that's dealt with. There's a lot of different technical things going on at the moment. We're trying to develop strategies around this kind of issue, and with Wi-Fi networks becoming more prevalent and people using their devices anywhere. But that's something that I think does need to be developed a lot more in the future.